Welcome to Let's Connect Greater Portland, a show about the changes and challenges we face and the great things that people are doing to make Greater Portland the best place in the country. I'm Christina Egan, your host. Today, we're talking about why a vibrant and independent press is essential for self-government. But the newspaper industry's financial struggles have resulted in fewer reporters covering local news, both here in Maine and around the country. Now, the owner of most of Maine's newspapers, including the Portland Press-Herald, the American Journal, and the Lakes Region Weekly, and the Forecaster newspapers, is putting his newspapers up for sale. What does the sale mean for the future of journalism in Maine and the impact on local government? And what can be done to strengthen journalism in Maine? I'm here today with Bill Nemitz, a former Portland Press-Herald columnist, who today heads the Maine Journalism Foundation. I'm also here with Krista Chappell, Vice Chair of the Gray Town Council, and Jarrod Maxfield, a member of the Windham Town Council. Hey, Bill, it's great to have you here.
Great to be here, Christina. Thank you.
And Krista and Jarrod, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For all of you out there listening, if you have a question about the future of local journalism, please join the conversation and give us a call at 780-4909. Again, that's 780-4909. Bill, we're going to dive right in. I'm going to start with you and talk about the state of local journalism today.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
That's a question.
It's a big one. So how do you see it? What is the state of journalism today?
Well, I think the state of journalism, particularly when we talk about print journalism or newspaper journalism, it's online as well, it's threatened, frankly. It really is. We've all seen the declines in the size of newspapers, the scope of them, the staffs. However, I will say Maine, relative to the rest of the country, is actually doing quite well. With one small exception in York County, all the newspapers in Maine are owned within Maine. They're nothing owned by an outside chain. The newsrooms, particularly at the Press-Herald, are by industry standards healthy and vibrant. But we all face the same pressures that other newspapers do, and that is this business model that has been overtaken and kind of overrun, I think, over the past 25 years or so by the internet, and an inability to, I think, move quickly enough to recover from that. So a lot of news right now, news models, if you will, in Maine are undergoing a re-examination. Looking for better and more effective ways to keep them alive and eliminate the profit pressures that have driven most newspapers traditionally over the centuries. So there's a lot happening. There's a push toward nonprofit news ownership, which is what we're all about. And we're very hopeful that we're going to come out of this era, which has been very challenging, with something that's a lot more sustainable.
It sounds like it's been a real struggle to adapt the business model of newspapers to like the 21st century technology. You mentioned the internet. Can you explain a little bit about how the internet has created new pressures for the traditional news business model?
The first one was Craigslist. Craigslist arrived in the 1990s, I guess.
Yeah.
And there went the classified market.
Mm-hmm.
And then came Google and other search engines that do a lot of analytics having to do with advertising, and there goes a lot of the retail advertising. And also there are ways now for businesses, car dealers, whoever, to communicate much more directly with their market. So the newspaper is the conduit for all of that information, which was commercial in nature and generated advertising revenue. Is no longer is as relevant. At the same time, circulation has been challenged by the fact that many people now get their news not from the paper, but from any number of social media platforms that essentially take our news and run with it in a lot of cases. So the two principal revenue sources, advertising and circulation, both came under threat during the same period.
And you started your journalism career a long time ago in 1977 at the Morning Sentinel in Waterville. And you covered City Hall and the Planning Board. How has journalism changed since then, particularly the coverage of municipal, like city and town issues?
Yeah, it's changed a lot, and a lot of that is because of thinner staffs. When I was in Waterville at the Morning Sentinel, we had, if there was a planning board meeting, a city council meeting, and a school board meeting, and very often it was, on the same night, we had all three of those things staffed. and with a full byline story in the paper the next day.
Wow.
That's no longer possible under the staffing levels that we have now. So it was much more vibrant. When I came down to Portland in 1983, I was the city. I worked first as a reporter, then became the editor of the Evening Express, for anybody who's old enough to remember that.
Have two papers a day, right?
It was the afternoon paper.
Yeah.
And we had a network. It was built on a network of correspondents who were independent contractors who worked for, were assigned to maybe 2 or 3 towns each, and their job, the towns you folks are in, for example, where their job was to cover 2 or 3 of those towns, and they were out there every night, every day, covering these papers. Frankly, that's a model that I am. It's one of my pet little fantasies is to try to recreate something like that, where we had this core of correspondents, if you will, whose job it was to cover the small towns, and in doing so, certainly include local government in that.
Well, I heard Krista exclaim "Wow" when you were talking about the multiple reporters covering local politics. Why did you say "Wow"?
It would be fantastic if we had any kind of attention at any of our meetings. Oftentimes we're speaking to an empty room. I mean, we record our meetings so people can watch them at their own convenience. But yeah, if we had that kind of flexibility and outreach without having to initiate it through the town staff, I think it would be a healthier environment for our community, for sure.
Yeah, and Jarrod, it's kind of a strange thing for a politician like yourself, if I can call you a local politician.
I don't need to be insulted.
You don't like that.
Yeah,
So Jarrod is a longstanding elected official in Windham, and to want the press at your meetings, sometimes people think, well, wouldn't it be better just to be able to do it under the radar? But do you agree with Krista that it's really important to have the press there?
absolutely. And, I'm sure Krista hears it, but on our town councils and select boards, before I joined, I heard a council person say, we do all the work and we get to the 5-yard line, and that's when the defense shows up. And like Krista said, all of our meetings they're live, they're in public, they're recorded, they're on Windham, ours are on Facebook, on our website, they're on public TV. But frankly, people just don't have the time to get into the weeds on all that stuff. So what ends up happening is we push through and we work on big projects and things that'll benefit our communities. And then, sometimes we get to the end and we'll hear from somebody who may oppose something for one or another reason and say, well, when did you do this? Or you did this all in the back room in a shady, dark corner.
Right.
It's like, no, absolutely not. We literally did all of this in public, and we want you to be involved, the public. We want you to be informed. And, as Bill mentioned, the newspaper was one of the greatest ways to get that information out. My first 6.5 years on the Windham Town Council, the first 3 years, we often had a reporter sitting in the back of the room, from the Lakes Region Weekly. And so we would have that article every week and get that information out there. But without that conduit, it's becoming harder and harder. One of the ways we're responding in Windham, and frankly it cost us money, is in this year's budget, we are hiring a communications director, because we need to find ways to not only get information out to people, but make sure they get the proper information and the facts. The town's job, my job, isn't to, especially the towns, it's not to sell you, but I want to make sure people have the facts. So when you make a decision, yay or nay, whether you're for or against something, just do it based on the actual facts, not the internet spin, or the void gets filled with the negativity and not the positive things. So it's getting harder and harder to do that. So yes, you would think that we don't want to be written about and we don't want the information out there, but it's literally just the opposite. We want it and we desperately need it.
Well, you make a good point, because I think what people also don't realize is that there's a tax implication for not having that coverage. You mentioned you had to hire a staff person. We also have a communications coordinator on staff to manage our communications. And this year we're going to the extra step of mailing our budget information to every single household in town. And that doesn't come without a cost. But we want to make sure people are informed and can make informed decisions when they go to the polls. So, but like I said, it does come with tax implications when we're lacking that kind of coverage locally.
It's interesting to see kind of some of the decline in local journalism and the rise in the hiring of communications officers. When I started in this job about 7 years ago, I think that only the city of Portland had one. And now towns that are small, like Gray, are starting to hire communications officers because there is a void that lots of people will fill on social media with information that may not necessarily be correct. So right now you are listening to Let's Connect, a show about the issues we face in Greater Portland and the movers and shakers that are leading the way. I'm Christina Egan, and today I'm talking about why a vibrant and independent press is essential for democracy and how we can make sure local journalism survives into the future. I'm here with former Press Herald columnist Bill Nemitz and two local municipal leaders that I adore, Krista Chappell and Jarrod Maxfield. So, Bill, I'd like to go back to you. We know that you mentioned early on that there is the sale of the Portland Press Herald and actually the overall umbrella company, Masthead, Maine. And that's happening like right now. So and Reed Brower, who is the owner, wants to sell these Maine newspapers. And you talked before about how right now, Maine is an exception nationally in that so many of our newspapers are locally owned in Maine. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why that's important to have owners in Maine and a little bit about the pending sale.
Sure. Well, what's happening nationally and what really motivated us to form as a foundation, the Maine Journalism Foundation last summer, was a phenomenon that we see lots of other places, and it's where healthy, vibrant newspapers are put up for sale, and companies come in that are driven more than anything else by return on investment, and I mean quick return on investment. So they tend to bid very high for these properties, and upon arriving in the market, the first thing they do is liquidate whatever hard assets there are. For example, real estate, that kind of thing. They'll sell the real estate. Masthead, Maine's real estate has already been sold, so at least there's that.
So but like the land and
everything's leased. Yeah,
the printing press.
We all know the old Press Herald building is a boutique hotel now.
Yeah.
And so on and so on. But then they look at operating expenses, and the next way that they recoup quickly on their initial investment is to very severely cut operating expenses. The most expensive part of a newspaper is the newsroom.
Which means the people.
Exactly. So what you see is staffs, in some cases, cut in half, even worse. And the whole product, the content shrinks. And the market, especially in a place like Maine where we are actually, a lot of folks might not realize how good we've had it all these years. Wake up one day, and even despite some of the challenges that you folks already face in your communities, there's a collective gasp, like, what happened? Where did it all go?
It comes on suddenly to people that have been readers who don't really understand how the newspaper industry is changing.
So what we're trying to do is come up with a different model, and that is one that, number one, eliminates that profit pressure by being a nonprofit. Any profit that does exist is put back into the product and reinvested in the newsroom, which every newsroom needs, particularly when it comes to developing better online content, digital content, which in itself can open up new revenue streams. You might look at the New York Times, for example, and if you see that great cooking recipe.
Oh, I subscribe to
and
that.
all of a sudden you have to pay for it.
Yeah,
So,
New York Times cooking, yeah.
There's that. And it also, of course, as a nonprofit, opens up the philanthropic revenue stream, which doesn't exist right now in the commercial.
And foundation grants,
yes,
philanthropic
exactly.
contributions.
And that's not to say that you're entirely reliant on that. You still sell advertising or sponsorships, whatever you might call them, depending on your tax status. But you're loosening the pressure for return on investment or alleviating it, and at the same time creating new ways to support the business. So that's really what we're all about. And there are hybrid models to that where you can have a nonprofit ownership of what's called a B Corp or a public benefit corporation, which is for profit. And those can coexist, under the same umbrella. So there are a lot of different options for looking at this, but the biggest one for us is to maintain what we call the news ecosystem as it exists right now in Maine, and try to protect it from what would be a very adverse outcome, we think, for everyone.
So tell us a little bit about this organizing effort to create this nonprofit called the Maine Journalism Foundation. Who's behind it and who are you working with?
Yeah, myself, we're a small board right now. It's myself as president and two other folks, Bill Burke, who you probably know was until recently owner of the Portland Sea Dogs, and a woman by the name of Emily Barr, who lives in Cape Elizabeth, and she is a recently retired CEO of the Graham Media Group, which is basically the TV stations owned by the Washington Post. She spent much of her career working for Donald Graham and running those stations, and very well versed in the business side of media. And it's been the three of us. We have an advisor by the name of Carlos Barrio Nuevo, who's with Public Media Company, which specializes in nonprofit news models. And we've been slugging away particularly for the last 2 or 3 months, since the sale process has become much more active, and meeting with local foundations, meeting with national foundations, local donors, online fundraising thing. We've had over 400 people donate, and surprisingly, the average donation, and those are folks who just want to make their voices heard. They're not people necessarily of deep capacity.
Yeah.
However, the average donations are up over $500 per
Wow.
donation. So
That's great.
it's demonstrated to us that while it's going to take a lot more than those donations to get over the hump here, it demonstrates to us that there's this groundswell of support when people realize that this content on which they've relied for so long could be threatened.
And we have a tradition in Maine of supporting Maine Public on the radio, where it's a lot of listener support, and I imagine there's going to be a lot of reader support for a nonprofit in the print industry.
That's right. And actually, we've been in discussions with Maine Public about, since we're all in the nonprofit world, and you want everybody rowing in the same direction here. You don't want to be in a competitive posture with somebody who does the great work that they do. So there have been some very interesting conversations about collaboration between what we would become in Maine Public, and Rick Schneider, the CEO there, he's been very, very receptive and very supportive to exploring the possibilities.
So this new foundation is going to be bidding on the sale of Masthead. Is that correct?
That is ongoing. That's
Ongoing.
right now.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's a very exciting prospect.
Yes, it is, and we're kind of we're well into that process right now, and everybody is. Obviously, there's not a lot I can say about it beyond that,
Right.
other than the fact that it's an ongoing process, and there are a lot of moving parts, and we're hoping that some kind of positive resolution might come out of this in the pretty near future, we hope.
So if the foundation is successful in buying Masthead, what do you hope for as an outcome for readers? Like, what will readers see?
Well, in the immediate sense, I would hope it would be as seamless as possible. What we're trying to prevent is what we see as the kind of disintegration of the product. So to the extent that readers don't notice it short term, I think that would be a very good thing. Immediately beyond that, however, there are certain capital investments that we feel are overdue, particularly in the digital realm.
Mm-hmm.
And so we would, in addition to raising money for the sale, for the acquisition, it's of equal importance to us that we start off with sufficient capital to be able to kind of breathe some life into some projects that I won't say that they're stagnant, but they need attention.
Yeah,
right
kind of
now.
Upgrade the Press Herald's digital presence.
Right. If you go on, for example, if you go on the Washington Post or the New York Times, and reading many of their stories now is a multimedia experience.
Right.
You have copy, but you're scrolling while you read, and you might have visual
Video.
photos, videos,
Yep.
sound, everything.
Yep.
That's where we need to be, because
Yeah.
that is how, particularly in younger generations today, this is how they consume their information. And for us to expect them to pick up that piece of paper every day and flip through the pages like some of us of a certain age might, it's not going to happen. So we really need to bring the product, the content to them at a level that they're not only able but eager to consume it. And that's our charge right now.
I'm talking today with Bill Nemitz, a former columnist for the Portland Press Herald, and Krista Chappell and Jarrod Maxfield with Gray and Windham, respectively. We'd love you to join the conversation about the importance of local journalism to democracy. Please call in at 780-4909. Again, 780-4909. And you're listening to Let's Connect with Christina Egan, your host. So, Krista, you recently published an op-ed in the Portland Press Herald about the importance of journalism, and you coined, or maybe you didn't coin, but you said news desert. And
Yeah.
I'm very curious about what that means.
Well, just speaking from my own experience in Gray, it basically means that there isn't any local news coverage, at least any significant coverage for our municipal government or any activities going on in town. The Lakes Region Weekly does have an Inside Gray section once per week, but I have found when reading it, they typically just pick up a lot of the content that we publish as part of our town implemented newsletter that our municipal staff puts together, which it can be informative, but I struggle with the fact that it's solely a government voice. There's not a lot of interpretation of what that content means. It's just
Just the facts.
just the facts, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But I think one
Hard
of
for people to always
Yeah,
understand just from the facts.
right, you don't
though,
want to
yeah.
digest it quite as well,
yeah.
and it's also not as engaging. And to be honest, a lot of the stuff we talk about is very dry and technical. So I think to have someone who can to reinterpret that to a general audience would be important. Yeah, so we have been missing our local newspaper in Gray, which was called the Gray News, for over a decade now, and we often hear people lamenting the fact that we just don't have that here. I think in addition to it just being informative, it was also a way for residents to connect with one another and feel like they're part of the community. And I think we struggle with that in Gray to this day, where we don't know how to get folks together in a way that's productive and just part of the social fabric of living in a community. So that's what we're feeling as part of a news desert.
Yeah, and Bill, do you see any opportunity, if you're able to purchase the Press Herald, of being able to address this phenomenon of news deserts?
I do. I think it gets back to my correspondence fantasy, but I think that we need to find ways to produce what I call microlocal or hyperlocal content that is really of interest only to people primarily in that community. And you're so right. When that disappears, I look up the coast to Harpswell, where they have a nonprofit newspaper now called the Harpswell Anchor, and it grew out of exactly what you described, Krista, where they lost their paper during the pandemic, and of all the times, for people to feel isolated already, and a very dedicated core of people up there have built it back, and it's actually functioning in the black. They hired an editor. I think they're hiring they just hired their second reporter. It's remarkable how. Obviously, you need some people of some capacity to fund this, but at the same time, it has breathed that new life back into the community, and everybody is back where they were in Gray when they had the Gray News. Where you had that starting point every day, or week or whatever, where everyone at least starts out with the same information, and then they can branch out from there with their opinions, which is fine. But when you eliminate that core of fact and truth and information in a community, what we've witnessed is that's when things tend to spiral out of control.
And Jarrod, before this program, we were talking a little bit about the waves of news coverage that kind of come and then go in Windham. Can you talk a little bit about what the situation is around local journalism in Windham?
Sure. Krista, as she mentioned in Gray, the news desert, in Windham, playing off that, I think of us as a news oasis, because we're very lucky. We have a fantastic group and a family in town who have purchased years ago, I think they just had their 10-year anniversary, the Windham Eagle. It gets mailed to every resident in Windham, which is fantastic. But like Bill just said, the people in Harpswell, they have an editor and they're just going to hire another reporter. These small papers can only do so much, and they can only be in so many places at once. So while we do have coverage, a lot more than other places. There's a lot of things that don't get covered, and there's a lot of things that, and Krista, you just said a lot of things we do are kind of boring and technical and things like that.
Yeah.
And one of the issues we've run into is you might get a reporter from the Lakes Region Weekly or someone, maybe they'll come in and they do a one-off story, but they don't quite get it, to be honest. And then what you read in the paper, and you've sat there and you've done the work, and you're like, well, I really appreciate the effort to get the information out, but this is not quite accurate. Because really what we need is we need that person who's sitting there.
Context.
We need someone who's being paid, to be a reporter and to be in our council and select board chambers every week or every other week whenever we have meetings, and absorb the information the same way we do so that we can get that information out. But unfortunately, and I'm sure this goes back hundreds of years since they started newspapers, salacious things sell more than regular boring news. But like Bill said, if you were in the old days, if the advertising was paying for the majority of the paper, and you could bring in some of the more exciting things that people, I don't want to call it gossip or whatever, but the things that are not always personally I think is newsworthy, that will subsidize the actual important news. But we're at a point where I think, unfortunately, in a lot of our school boards or council chambers and things, if it's not arguing or fighting or something salacious, I'll say it, it's not newsworthy now, because it's not actually going to move eyeballs to the newspaper or to their online. It's not going to sell advertising. So boring is important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
if I put that on bumper
I
sticker.
agree.
So,
And I think the best journalism is and this goes back to something Krista just said. The best journalism is the journalism that takes that kind of baseline information and humanizes it.
Right.
And I agree with. I hear what you're saying about the more wild and crazy stuff, but my goal as a journalist was always to take that boring agenda item and find a way to illustrate how it intersects with a person or a group of people's lives. And so I always thought that while City Hall reporting begins at City Hall, the best City Hall reporting takes place outside of City Hall, where you go out into the community and see how these policies, votes, issues, whatever they might be, are actually affecting people's lives. And I think that's kind of the gold standard for local reporting, is to show here's what matters and here's why it matters to you. And that's something I think we need to get back to. Rather, the stenographic reporting is fine in the absence of anything else, but if you really want to engage a community, you have to hold the mirror up to them and say, here's how it affects you.
That's what I loved so much about your columns, Bill, is you always brought a person in to explain a larger issue. It's really beautiful writing. And thank you so much today for coming and share the information about the possible sale to the nonprofit. Very exciting news. And Krista and Jarrod, always a pleasure to have you.
thank you.
Thanks
for
so much for
having me.
having.
Good luck to your group.
Yeah,
Thank you very,
yeah,
very
best
much,
of luck.
Maine.
Sure,
Yeah.
thanks.
I also want to thank Joshua Brister, our sound engineer, and WMPG, which collaborates with the Greater Portland Council of Governments in producing Let's Connect Greater Portland. You can reach us on Instagram at Let's Connect Radio. Join us this time next week. Until then, be kind to each other and to one another. I'm Christina Egan. See you next time on Let's Connect Greater Portland.